Boys and girls that are going to children's church, you are dismissed. Boys and girls that are staying in the room today, I am only going to cue you for 3 of the 4 boxes. Box 4, you can draw whatever comes from the sermon that you think is important. This morning we're going to be in Acts chapter 15, finishing out chapter 15, beginning of chapter 16. If you're using the Pew Bible, it's on page 1099. If you're reading along, watching from home, I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version this morning. I'm very grateful for Pastor Sam preaching for me last week. It allowed me to just be a part of the church on Sunday. It was good to be a part of you on Sunday. It also gave me an opportunity to spend some extra time with the revitalization task force to think through, to digest, and to even put some plans in place for your survey responses. As a reminder, at the end of the service today, we'll have a business meeting after the service where we walk through the report from the revitalization task force. But at the end of this sermon today, I'm going to wrap up hopefully a little bit early. We're going to have our invitation song, our offering, and then we're going to enter a season of prayer in the sanctuary where we just call out to the Lord independently and corporately for God to continue to bring revival in our lives, to give us a fresh, new desire to love Him with our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So if I do my job and wrap up a few minutes early, we're not getting out super early today. We're getting out of sermon and into a season of prayer on the early side this morning. So just to recap all of that for you again, first preaching, then singing as a time of response and offering, and then season of prayer before our announcements. Service concludes, and then business meeting. By the way, it was good to sing and to celebrate, and I enjoy clapping from time to time in the songs, and there's the part of me that wants to clap, but I struggle to clap on beat. I've often said I will know I am in heaven when I can sing correctly and clap on beat. Because I can normally not do either of those. I can't even tell when I'm not singing on pitch, okay? And I often can tell when I'm not clapping on beat, but my clapping is very inconsistent. So I've learned through the years that the one way for me to stay on is actually to watch the members of the band. I have to watch Christy or Ashlyn. And sometimes they're up here, and I think they're actually doing it for me to get back on. And other times they're just barely tapping their hip. And I'm like, that's not a big signal, but I know what that means. That means when I'm clapping opposite their hip, I'm not helping the band stay on pace. So just a little thing for those of you, the 2 of you in the room that are like me and cannot clap well, but you want to clap, watch them. Okay? So, that being said, let's walk through Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 36, with the context of what Pastor Sam preached last week about how the church gathered in Jerusalem dealt with a controversy, handed down a ruling on keeping mission going forward and Christians getting along with each other despite their differences. Paul and Barnabas go back to Antioch. We arrive at verse 36, and we're going to read about 10 verses. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now Barnabas wanted to take with him John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Paul came also to Derbe and Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. It's a beautiful summary there at the end, as we often find in the book of Acts, what God is doing through His Spirit, through His people, for His glory and the sake of the neighborhoods and the nations. The churches are being strengthened. They're growing in depth and in number. They're developing into the people that God would have them to be, to communicate the gospel in the region that God has them in. It's a beautiful thing there at the end of this reading this morning. It's a summary of what's happening. Starting next week, we'll look at Paul on his journey and where else he goes. But I want to recap and explain a few things that are going on. But boys and girls, in box 1, I want you to draw that summary that there's more and more churches with more and more happy Christians in them. More and more churches, more and more happy Christians in them. That is what's happening at the end of the text. More and more churches, more and more happy Christians in those churches, as they grow in the Lord despite difficulties. Now, there's some TV shows for kids that have been around a long time. I remember as a kid, Mr. Rogers and His Neighborhood. Never liked the show, but I remember that one, okay? Won't you be my neighbor? There's little phrases from different shows that reflect the generation in some cases, but also in more recent years, shows don't seem to stick around as long. So though Sesame Street was around for a long, long time, you can't really date yourself with that one. But so many of the shows that my kids watched growing up are not around anymore. Okay? And even within them, like one kid knows one song and one phrase and another doesn't. There was this show when my girls were younger called Special Agent Oso. Yes, I hear from some of them. And Special Agent Oso was a very strange bear with like a vest and a cape. You know, he's like a special agent. He did special agent stuff. And he's like a goofball, essentially. He's like a regular dude who resolves problems. But he has this one phrase that he uses because he's always runs into this problem. And then he tries to fix the problem. And in the process of fixing the problem, it does not go the way that he drew it up. And he uses this little phrase as it's happening. It's all a part of the plan, more or less. And he normally says it in a resigned fashion, as in good cartoon stuff, as he is like fallen from a 3-story building and gone kersplat, or a piano has been dropped on his head, or something like that. It's all according to the plan, more or less. Well, for Paul, in Acts chapter 15, at the end of it and the beginning of 16, he's got to be thinking, God, I get this is your plan, but it wasn't my plan. It's all according to your plan, God, more or, yes, more. My plan, more or, way less. It's all according to the plan, more or less. He's got to be ready to just throw his hands up in the air and say, my plans? Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. I'm all the way down to Plan J at this point, God. And that's just today. That's what's happening with Paul. And yet, God is not only resolving problems, He is allowing the gospel to be communicated, churches to be strengthened, and in numbers and in depth for God's glory. God's plans are better than our plans. The way that plays out early in this text, we have Paul saying to Barnabas, hey Barnabas, we've got this good decree, how people are going to get along in the gospel. Let's go back to the churches that we visited. Let's do a round 2. Barnabas, I got this, you remember the food that we had over there? Remember how good things were along the journey? Remember when we saw that beautiful scenery on our trip? Barnabas, do you remember those brothers and sisters? Let's go check on Barnabas. Even remember how things were tough, but like God carried us through? Barnabas, let's go for another round. And Barnabas is like, yeah, Paul, great. Let's get John Mark. And Paul's like, wait a minute, John Mark, didn't he quit? I don't take quitters. Why would I take a quitter on God's mission? God doesn't quit. He quit. He's out. To which Barnabas says, don't speak about my cousin that way. They're cousins. All right. And he says, and Paul, second chance? You ever heard of the second chance for a person? Like, Paul, how many times has God shown you a second chance? Paul's like, well, I didn't quit. He quit. Give him a second chance. And they go at each other. And the language doesn't suggest that they just did paper, rock, scissors to determine it. They didn't flip a coin to decide what was going to happen and how they were going to get along together. No, it's a sharp disagreement. They could not resolve their conflict. One said yes, the other said no, and they went back and forth and back and forth. And in the words of our current teenagers, they had drama. And a lot of it. And then it ended with them saying, all right, we're going to go our separate ways. Barnabas took along John Mark. He went and proclaimed the gospel, strengthening churches. And Paul took Silas and grabbed Timothy and went along and strengthened churches and shared the gospel. And what looked like this big problem that we're going to have to get resolved actually multiplied the mission team. Now, who was right, Barnabas or Paul? The Bible doesn't tell us. What happened to their friendship? The Bible doesn't tell us. What the Bible shows us is that despite their differences, they multiplied their mission by God's Spirit. They don't get along, but they both go for God's mission. God doesn't resolve it speaking authoritatively. God doesn't give them a sign and put them back together. But they also don't sit around and argue with each other endlessly. They don't play this out throughout the public and throughout the church, and they don't cause a church split in Antioch. They split up. They both pursue mission. Barnabas takes John Mark, heads one way. And we don't hear much from Barnabas in his journey, but later we see throughout Paul's writing that John Mark was useful to Paul. So, Paul found John Mark not just a quitter, but later useful. God in His Spirit worked in that way. And we see God using mightily Timothy with letters from Paul to Timothy, book of 1st and 2nd Timothy, Timothy's role in churches in all those ways. God used the second chance. Barnabas gave John Mark, and God used Timothy joining their party as well. Boys and girls, box 2. Draw two people arguing with each other, like Paul and Barnabas. Draw them arguing, and then draw them leaving with a new co-worker and a new friend. Okay, there. Draw them arguing with each other, and then draw them going their separate ways with a new friend. They could not agree on the people to involve in their mission, but they pursued God's mission by the power of the Spirit, and God's plan was carried out, even if Paul was thinking that's all a part of the plan, more or less. Not plan A according to them, but it was all part of God's plan. It wasn't pleasant or enjoyable, but it was all part of God's plan. So instead of allowing their conflict to stomp out the gospel witness, arguing incessantly about the past and their preferences about who was right and wrong, they instead got busy pursuing gospel mission. It would be nice today if we could all get along and saw everything the same way. But most of you have family members, either that you talk to regularly, that live in your home, or can think back to when you regularly spent time, either as a child growing up in a home or around other people. People are the worst. They can do awesome things, but they just don't see things the right way. Like, they don't want the food that you want. Like in our family, if you want to start a good argument, let's talk about what we should have for lunch today. We'll get 5 or 6 different opinions. And if we make it a vote, then we'll have an argument over what vote wins. Mom and Dad win, okay? Most of the time. We don't agree on things like that. People don't agree on food preferences. People don't agree on what radio station to play in the car. You want to have another argument in the car? Let's talk about what radio station to play. Okay, my kids have some ones, my wife has some ones, and I have this marvelous radio station called Silence. It is beautiful. Okay, I never misunderstand the lyrics. I never have to worry about what's on beat, what's off beat. It's marvelous. And there's a second radio station called Sports Talk Radio, and it's really good. Okay, but you want to start an argument, talk to people about what they like. And then talk to people about the best ways to get things done. Like, what's the best way to drive somewhere? How long should you stay in the passing lane before getting into the right lane? Or is it just a permanent passing lane? Okay? People don't always agree about trivial things. And some of you are like, the right way to drive is not a trivial thing. Okay? People don't always agree about how churches should do things. And many of those things are preference and opinion issues, and they're not gospel issues. They're not even sin issues. They can become sin issues when we insist on our own way at the expense of all others. When we think selfishly rather than selflessly, they can become sin issues. But if Paul and Barnabas could not get along perfectly, we should not expect that we're always going to have identical preferences and opinions, even on how to pursue God's mission. And yet we need to pursue God's mission and, whenever possible, hold on to each other with love and with grace. They had to go their separate ways because they were pursuing a mission. And that meant when one said, let's take him, the other said not, that they didn't just sit around and work that one out. They both, by God's grace, were sent out and doubled the mission team. They went about the mission despite their disagreement, despite probably their hurt feelings. And they prioritized mission when there was no clear right or clear wrong. What furthers the mission was more important than working every detail and getting everyone on the identical page. The page was God's mission. The mission is bigger than disagreements on important stuff, but non-essential, non-sin stuff. This wasn't a sin issue. So also today, we do not need to let our preferences or our opinions or disagreements with other believers keep us from glorifying God amongst the neighborhoods and the nations. When we're so busy arguing with each other on things that aren't important, we don't have time to pursue mission. I don't know how long they disagreed. But what I do know is that they didn't permanently disagree. They didn't spend years in disagreement on how to work this thing out, sit around and argue with each other, grab some other people and start acting in an ungodly way, talk to others and say, well, if you don't do it my way, then I'm going to tell the church in Jerusalem about you. I'm going to tell these guys about you. I'm going to quit doing this. If you don't do it my way, I'm going to cause a problem. No, they said the glory of God is more important. And they pursued the glory of God despite their differences with other believers. Some things just don't get worked out this side of heaven, but the mission matters most. And it is through the pursuit of their mission, by the way, that somehow God brought them back together in the sense of harmony, and that John Mark was well loved and useful to Paul sometime later. It worked out, but it took a while before we see it working out. Barnabas had gone on the mission that God has for him and John Mark. Now we get to chapter 16. Chapter 16 begins Paul in this missionary journey that we're going to trace through the next couple of chapters. Paul comes to Derbe and to Lystra. Remember Lystra, the wild, wild west, where everybody got excited about everything. First, you're God's. Second, we're going to stone you. We thought that Paul was dead, but they didn't know that he wasn't dead, or God raised him from the dead, whatever happened there. Paul then goes back into Lystra. And now, Paul is there again with Silas, and he finds a young guy, Timothy, whose mother was Jewish, his father was Greek. And Timothy had been raised with the physical signs of being Greek rather than the sign of circumcision. His dad had won out on that one. Okay? But Timothy has a great reputation amongst the believers as a young man. It's likely that Timothy is between 15 and 30, so let's think of him as 20 years old. At a time when people are wasting their life and doing a lot of things that get told to be cool, Timothy's got a great reputation for knowing the Lord, loving God, and living for Him in a difficult circumstance or a difficult culture. So Paul comes along and he's like, hey, Silas, let's take this young guy. He's got a heart for God. Let's take him. And Timothy has to be sitting. I mean, can you imagine like being there right now and being like, wait a minute, Paul, Silas, this is pretty sweet. I mean, I would like to say, can you imagine if like Pastor Ron and I grabbed one of you young men and said, hey, we're going to take you along for a journey because we see what God's doing in your life. And you would be like, oh yeah, Pastor Jason, Pastor. Okay, maybe you don't feel that way about us, but I have all ideas that Timothy was sign me up. This is frontier stuff. This is the few, the proud, the missionaries. Okay? This is a big deal. This is to get selected by Paul and Silas is a big deal. I imagine that Timothy is like, yes, yes, and more yes. And don't worry, Paul. I know you've only got an opening because that wimped out. Okay? I won't quit. I'm not a quitter. I'm a tough dude. Okay? I mean, the reason that he didn't have he had an opening on the team is because somebody had wimped out before. So Timothy has to be thinking, I am not quitting. Don't worry, Paul, you can count on me. To which Paul says, good. I've got a difficult assignment for you first. And turns to Timothy and says, circumcision's on the radar, buddy. And he has to be thinking, no anesthesia, this isn't pleasant, this isn't good. Paul, do you remember that Jerusalem council thing? Like, to be respectful, sir, Mr. Paul, sir. Remember Jerusalem council? Or did you miss Pastor Sam's sermon on that? Like, I'm on board with the mission, but remember, didn't you guys just say that people don't have to be circumcised to be a believer? To which Paul says, yeah, I remember that. I was there. Timothy's like, well, why are you telling me? To which Paul says, this isn't about your salvation. Because when we go and share the gospel with Jews, they're going to hear you're only half Jew and they're going to full reject the gospel. They're going to be cut off from Christ because of you. They're not going to be willing to listen because of you. So though this isn't a gospel and your salvation, this is a gospel issue and others hearing the gospel. To which Timothy says, the gospel matters more to me, not only than my preferences, but than my pain. Timothy doesn't say, well, I only have to abstain from meat sacrificed to idols and blood and sexual immorality. That's what the Jerusalem Council said I have to do. Instead, he said the mission matters more, not only than my preferences, but my pain. Others hearing the gospel is more important than my rights. And he has that occur. They go along with their mission. They go on throughout the cities, verse 4. They delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders. And they probably told them about Timothy too, and his willingness to sacrifice for the sake of mission, despite not having to. God's plan for Timothy that he thought was plan A. I mean, I just imagine, this is sanctified imagination going on for a minute. It's not in the Bible that they had this interaction, but I just imagine that when Timothy was like, hey, I want to be a part of the mission trip. Yes, of course, Paul, that he wasn't thinking through all of the pain that he would face in the future, distant future with Paul, but much less in the present. And yet, God's plan was carried out through his people. It wasn't plan B or C or D or even Z. God's plan was still carried out. It was God's plan A. And his mission was carried out. 3 points of application from today. Okay? Our good plans are not always God's plans. Paul and Barnabas had a good plan. I liked their plan. Let's go back. Let's strengthen the churches. Let's share with them the good news. Good plans, not God's plan. There are times in life that our good plans are not always God's plans, and God's plans are much easier and smoother and better. There's some times in my life that I can look back and say, God, I thought you were doing this. I thought you were leading us here and to make you known in this situation. And then God brought us to Springfield, and it's much easier and more beautiful and delightful than what I thought God had for me. But there's also times that we can look through and say, God's plans were more difficult to go through than my good plans were. And yet they were still God's plans. Some of you had good plans of health, good plans of relationship, good plans of job opportunities, and ways in which you wanted to serve the Lord in all of those, and God said, that's not my plan. Good plans are not always God's plan, but God's plans are always better than our good plans. Boys and girls, in box 3, draw Paul wanting to go one way and God sending him another way with a different person. Continue when it gets hard to go with God's plan. Continue to trust in God's goodness when it's not according to your plan. We can make plans to serve God, write our own story, tell God how we want Him to let it play out, and then we surrender to God and say, God, it's your story through me, actually. Secondly, pursue God's mission for His glory, being celebrated even when others have disappointed you. Paul was disappointed with Barnabas and John Mark. Barnabas walked away disappointed with Paul. Disappointment with others can often derail mission. Neither of them, though, let their own ideas not being heeded or conflict with another keep them pursuing God's mission. Both of them were still taking someone and training someone that would later be incredibly useful. Invest in others in the things of faith, even when you've been disappointed by people. When someone abandons you, it can be hard to invest in the next person. But Paul and Barnabas both invest in people who later become incredibly useful for people. Senior adults in the room. You can look back on the pages of your life at this point, and you can recognize times that people have disappointed you. Senior adults in the room, you can look back at family members that have disappointed or friends that have disappointed. You can walk back on people and see people that have abandoned the gospel in your life. There's a good chance that some of you have invested not only as parents in ones that no longer walk with the Lord as they should, but maybe in other disciples. You've invested in them, and it hurts when someone that you have invested in and been close to abandons the things that they ought to be pursuing, or when a sharp disagreement arises that is not even a biblical faithfulness thing. Senior adults, with all of that scarring of the past, let me ask you, continue to do the investing for the future. Don't let the disagreement and the disappointment that you have felt in others keep you from investing again in some young men and young women like Timothy that have a heart and a passion for the Lord but need some direction and some investment? Don't let disappointment and disagreement with others keep you from investing in people yet again. Thirdly, here at the end, pursue God's mission for His glory being celebrated even when it's costly to you. Neither Paul or Barnabas got their way, but they kept pursuing mission because mission matters more than preferences, and mission for Timothy meant more than pain. They could have easily sat around and tried to get the church in Antioch to make this ruling, to settle things, to tell them who was right, who was wrong, but instead they absorbed the cost of the pain themselves, not getting their way, and they pursued God's mission for healthy churches and making the gospel known. And Timothy endured a very physical, personal struggle to make it easier to strengthen churches. The wording of the Jerusalem Council was, let's not make it hard, really, for the Gentiles to believe. But in Timothy's case, he said, oh, I get it. Let's not make it hard for the Jews to believe. Great personal cost. His personal cost should put our personal preference issues into perspective a little bit more. And we can learn something from Timothy and his personal cost. But we're directed by Philippians chapter 2 to look at the example of Christ and the personal cost that He paid, not considering self and selfishness, but selfless laying down of Himself, His own agenda to take up the Father's will for the good of others. We are called upon to look to Christ, which is who hopefully Timothy was looking to. These words from Philippians chapter 2 will be my concluding words, then we'll move into a time of worship. So if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, full accord, one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to the interest let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. It is because we can look to Christ as both our perfect example of selflessness for the sake of mission, but also as the one who has forgiven us when we have not done that we can gather, that we can make God known amongst the neighborhoods and the nations. So in this last invitation song, we're going to stand, we're going to sing, we're going to celebrate, we're going to cry out to God in prayer for Him to accomplish His will through us despite the difficulties. Then we'll spend some time asking God to revitalize us, to give us a passion for His glory that is greater than our passion for anything else, for us to prioritize mission over preference, for us to look to Christ as both our sacrifice in our place and the one who empowers us through His Spirit to follow His example. Let's rise now, stand, and sing.